Assistant President. I rise to speak on this important motion moved by the Honourable Trevor Khan, and I thank him for bringing it to the attention of the House. I think it's very important that this House acknowledges the significant anniversaries of pivotal events in our relatively youthful nation's history, as we did in a very meaningful way for the 100th anniversary commemorating the end of the Great War in this chamber. In the contemporary context of a pandemic and the curtailment of liberties and freedoms accompanied by panic buying, rationing and ramped up policing and military enforcement in our community, I think we are having a small taste of the conditions that Australians endured during the deprivations and the fears of invasion during World War II. VP, or Victory in the Pacific Day, also referred to as VJ, Victory over the Japanese Day, is celebrated on August 15. This date commemorates Japan's acceptance of the Allied demand for unconditional surrender on the 14th of August 1945. For Australians, it meant that the Second World War was finally over. The following day, 15th of August, is usually referred to as VP Day. Australians had been at war since the 3rd of September 1939, so the surrender marked the end of nearly 6 years of conflict, with the loss and the stress and the fear that marked all those years. This year marks 75 years since the end of the Second World War, and it triggered euphoric celebrations across New South Wales, well known for the dancing through the streets of Sydney, as then Prime Minister Ben Chifley announced over the radio, quote, "Fellow citizens, the war is over. Let us remember those whose lives were given, that we may enjoy this glorious moment and may look forward to peace which they have won for us." Such fitting words. This year's celebrations were very different due to the COVID-19 pandemic, with many face-to-face commemorative events very restricted. The New South Wales Government and the Acting Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Geoff Lee, launched the One Month to VP Day campaign, encouraging veterans and their families to share their service stories in the lead up to the 75th anniversary of VP Day to ensure we can continue to acknowledge the service of veterans and, importantly, their families. The story collection is available online on the New South Wales War Memorial website, and it's extremely moving to hear the stories of Second World War veterans and their families, and we've heard some of those in other speeches. It's made me very proud, and I encourage all members in this House to go online and have a look at these stories. World War II is a significant event in Australia's history. Nearly 1 million Australians served in the armed forces during the war. It was also the first time since European settlement that Australia came directly under attack. On VP Day, we remember Australia's war efforts from 1942 to 1945 in the Pacific region, including in Singapore, Borneo, Malaya, Papua New Guinea, and New Britain. It was a time when people worked hard and cooperated together to defend the nation. Some 40,000 Australians didn't return home to their families. 40,000. Over 17,000 of them lost their lives while fighting in the war against Japan, some 8,000 of whom died in Japanese captivity. Losses, both human and material, amongst the Allied forces and civilians during the war were enormous, but are estimated to total approximately 4 million military dead, as well as 26 million civilian deaths. These brave young men and women gave the ultimate sacrifice to fight for our freedoms that we cherish, but all too often take for granted in Australia today. Mr Assistant President, there's been personal reflections, and I'll make a personal reflection about my family's experience. My personal connection to the war in the Pacific is not unique at all for most Australians. My late grandfather on my mother's side, Bruce Peterson, enrolled in the Medical Corps of the Reserve Forces, or the National Service, which I think the Reverend Noel was involved in the National Service. Whilst the AIF, of course, were overseas fighting in Europe and the Middle East, the menace of Japanese invasion was very real, and attacks thrusting downwards through the Pacific Islands, hopping from Singapore, ultimately to Papua New Guinea, and of course the horrendous attacks, bombing attacks on Darwin. In the absence of the Australian Army, the National Service were deployed to Port Moresby and up into the Owen Stanley mountain range, the Kokoda Track as we know it today, to confront the invading Japanese Imperial Army. A fierce army it was, as it advanced ferociously from the north planning to take Port Moresby. Of course, my pop, Bruce Peterson, was deployed in this desperate struggle to stall the advance of the Japanese, whilst the Australian Army returned from Europe was recalled. These were desperate times. The cream of our young men and the trained officers were in Europe and the Middle East with our army. Most of our serious warfighting equipment and materials were deployed to those theatres. Our airmen and women and naval forces were a long way from home. So you can imagine the trepidation the Australians must have felt. Let's not be mistaken. The National Service, designated essentially as a home guard, were not well trained and were not well equipped. But what they lacked in training and equipment, they made up for in sheer guts and determination. As history shows, they stalled the Japanese advance on Port Moresby at incredible human cost. They stalled the fierce, ruthless, well-trained and well-equipped Japanese advance long enough for the Australian Army, which Prime Minister Chifley had diverted at sea and ordered home, against Churchill's express wishes, to return and relieve them, and ultimately again at great cost on both sides, and I acknowledge Japanese costs were huge too, to drive the Japanese into sea. And I just divert from my speech to mention Paul Ham's excellent book on Kokoda, which is, I recommend that to members if they haven't read it, I'm sure they have. Really is one of the best books about the battle for Kokoda, and it does canvass the horrendous losses the Japanese went through too. I mean, these are young men that were conscripted to fight for Japan, and in the end abandoned in Kokoda, in Papua New Guinea, and died. Another book I will mention is sort of bookends, is Philip Bradley's D-Day to New Guinea, which is much more a technical book, but that talks about the pushing the Japanese out of Papua New Guinea and incredible bravery and the loss of life in those battles as well. So I know I've referenced both those books in this speech. My grandfather returned wounded, and like almost every soldier that fought in Papua New Guinea, diseased with malaria and other problems. And I regret to say, a changed man, and in the end the marriage to my beloved grandmother was another casualty of the war. That is not a unique casualty, and one at the time was barely appreciated. Today we struggle to support our armed forces personnel who have returned as they battle what we now know is post-traumatic stress disorder. And back in my pop's day, it was drinking with the old mates, trying to forget. And so I acknowledge, as I've done in this chamber, and indeed at a speech that I had the honour of giving, representing the Premier at the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park a few years ago on Anzac Day, the unrecorded toll, or the under-recorded toll, on the home front. The families directly impacted by loss and grieving, and those families that were torn apart by the conflict. If we were to commemorate this important military anniversary in a meaningful and practical way, it would be to redouble our efforts and our resources to supporting our returned service personnel and their families today. And we know about the horrendous impact that the contemporary service personnel still go through. Mr. Assistant President, VP Day is an extremely important day in Australian history. It's a day that we pause to remember the ultimate sacrifice for the young men and women that went to war to defend our nation and our freedoms. It's hard to put into words how thankful I am to this sacrifice. It is important that we always remember and continue to honour those who gave their lives and those who risked all they had for our country. I thank the Honourable Trevor Khan for bringing this motion to the House so we could pay tribute today. I commend the motion to the House.
Thank you.